All the chandeliers and imported art in the Brazão villa meant nothing against the thin, persistent keening that had settled into the walls. It threaded through the corridors, crawled under rugs, and sat stubbornly in the library where Fabio spent his nights pretending to work. It was a sound no amount of money could hush, the small, relentless cry of a baby who would not eat. They called him Gael. He had been born to a man who controlled entire skylines and to a woman who had withdrawn into marble and silence. For 4 months the child had refused bottles, spat out every spoon, and turned from the breast he had been offered as if it belonged to another world. The house hired specialists. It escorted nurses with impeccable resumes into its nursery. It tried patients, gadgets, formula from laboratories overseas, even lullaby machines that played ocean sounds at subsonic frequencies. Nothing worked. The baby's cheeks grew narrow. The cry grew thin. Fabio watched a collapse he could not buy his way out of. Money had taught him to imagine solutions, acquire a clinic, commission research, contract excellence. The helplessness of holding a child who was fading at the edges opened a new kind of vulnerability in him, one he had not bargained for. His voice lost its practiced steel when he spoke of Gael. At night, he walked the nursery and listened to the cry like a foreign sonar, trying to map an answer he could not purchase. The staff of the villa became the audience of a slow tragedy. Vera, the housekeeper, walked the corridors with crisp towels and an expression that meant she would not be moved by sentiment. Dolores, Fabio's mother, policed the family name the way some women polished silver, endlessly with an eye for smudges. She had spent lifetimes building a reputation that she protected with cashmere gloves and a practical, merciless logic. To Dolores, a crying infant was not just an ailment. It was a crack in a facade, a possible stain on a name. They tried professionals first. The best nannies came with references bound in leather, with certifications and training videos. They arrived in neat uniforms and left in the same hour, pale, defeated, their offers of techniques unsatisfactory under the sound of the baby's protest. The house would sigh with disappointment, then try another method. A lactation consultant suggested succession feeding. A pediatric gastroenterologist proposed hypoallergenic formulas. An infant therapist recommended controlled bonding exercises. Weeks passed like small, fruitless experiments. And then Joanna appeared. She was not the kind of woman you noticed at first in a house built to impress. Hired as a cleaner to take care of the smallest tasks that the villa's staff shrugged away, she moved like a person used to making herself small in the presence of wealth. Her uniform was plain, her hands bore the faint grooves of someone who had scrubbed and mended for years. She answered questions with a soft, direct voice and kept her eyes steady, not ingratiating, but present. From the first day, the cry pulled at her as if it were a thread connected to something inside her chest. To everyone else, it was an irritant. To Joanna, it was the only thing in the house she couldn't reconcile. She had learned early, by the loss of her own child, that some sounds burrowed deeper than others. She had been orphaned young. She had known hunger in that long, careful way that leaves a person practiced in doing without. She had also known mothers in her village who rocked newborns against rags of sunlight on their laps. She had held infants wrapped in thin cloth and felt the way a breath could become a life. That experience was not a credential on the sheet she had signed when taking the job, but it lived in the small, reflexive movements of her hands. She did not tell anyone she still produced milk. The body remembers in ways the mind does not always keep. Months after her baby had died, the breast had not entirely emptied of the echo of nursing. Joanna kept that memory tucked away like a private talisman and a wound. She did not offer it. In the villa, she mopped rooms and folded sheets, and when she passed the nursery, she pretended to be indifferent, as if the crying had long since become something the house emitted, like the smell of the roses in the courtyard. On a day when the rain made the marble floors of the atrium shine black, there was nothing dramatic about the moment it changed. It was not a cinematic revelation so much as a small, decisive thing. The nanny on duty had tried everything again: rocking, pacing, a formula that had been warmed precisely to laboratory suggestions. Gael's cheeks were hollowing into the first awkward angles of undernourishment. Fabio, who had sat in the nursery for more hours than he could admit, watched the child's mouth open and close and felt a crushing helplessness. Joanna was bringing in clean cloths, the kind she always kept rolled under her arm. She saw the baby's hands, tiny and pink, then saw the way his forehead creased, as if some memory of hunger was seeking a place to land. The instinct was sudden and fierce in her. She had been trained informally, in secrecy, the sort that poverty requires. You feed what you can feed without asking permission from the world. For a moment she turned the cloth over in her hands and thought of the one she had once wrapped a child in under a mango tree. And then she did a thing the house had never trained her to do. She asked the nanny in a whisper if she could try to soothe the baby. The request was simple enough that the nanny agreed. What harm in one more attempt? The nursery, with its moonlight paint and noise-canceling dimmers, felt suddenly small. Joanna moved as if she had been doing this since childhood. She sat on a low chair beside the crib and let her voice become a slow, low hum that had nothing of the polished tones of the villa. The baby turned his head toward a sound that was nothing like the mechanical lullabies he'd known. His eyes, watery and alert, fixed on the shape of her face. She felt, at that first touch, the way Gael's hands clutched at her sleeve. It was not possessive in the way of a spoiled child. It was a raw, primitive reach for something safe. Joanna did not hesitate. Against the rules she had always followed, she folded herself smaller, careful to maintain dignity and not to expose more of herself than the room's decency allowed. She brought the cloth up, and in an unplanned, wordless exchange, offered him the warmth of her chest. The change was immediate. It was not instantaneous magic. It was a slow, deepening of breath as the infant found a rhythm. The keening thinned, then subsided. The house, which had been a coil of anxiety, released a small, stunned silence. Fabio felt his own breath catch in the emptiness left by the cry. He had seen many professionals and many miracles of technology, but none had quieted the way the sound in that room died when the baby found what he needed. Joanna kept her eyes on the child as if she were reading the lines of an intimate book. She remembered each detail of the mother she had been, the weight of the infant's head on her collarbone, the way a nipple fit the curve of a baby's mouth like a forgotten puzzle piece. Tears pricked at her eyes, not for the villa, not for Fabio's money, but for the small human fact of the tiny body calming in her arms. She pressed down the whirl of things that threatened to flood in. The shame of being a maid touching a billionaire's child. The forbidden tenderness of a woman who had lost a child embracing another. The sudden, dangerous clarity that some needs were larger than property or class. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel useful in the way a human being can be when they prevent harm. The nanny remained an astonished silhouette in the doorway. No one had been taught to plan for this. There were no forms to fill out when the solution arrived from someone the house had assumed would simply keep floors clean. When Gael slept, finally with a steady face and lips no longer searching the world for sustenance, Joanna stepped away with a small, private exhale. There was a sudden, awkward lightness in the nursery, as if the room had been allowed to breathe. Fabio stood unmoving, palms pressed to his thighs. He had not announced himself. He had not expected to see the impossible. He could have asked questions then and there. He could have thanked her and pushed this moment into the tidy category of an isolated miracle. He did not. He felt gratitude that a child he loved was quiet, and he felt a dangerous, unfamiliar debt settle into his chest. He watched as Joanna wiped the corners of Gael's mouth with the cloth she had carried, and wondered what it meant that someone from whom he had previously taken service had just given him his son's life back. The early hours afterward were full of small, careful choices. Joanna returned to her tasks as if nothing had happened, folding sheets with the same slow deliberation. She did not announce her action, and the house did not call it a savior. The medical team noticed the baby's first real sleep and logged it as a positive sign without attributing the cause. The villa's neat machinery of staff and specialists rotated, and life returned to its organized motions. But in a pocket of the staff's world, something had shifted. A new, dangerous intimacy existed between the maid and the child. A new, unspoken bond sat like a stone in the center of a room that had been pristine until now. If there is a sound that marks the line between what is acceptable and what is scandalous in certain circles, it is the soft rustle of rumor. The villa was nothing if not monitored, by its staff, by distant relatives, by the quiet code of a house that had learned to speak in half-sentences. Joanna knew that one soft secret could be a gun in the wrong hands, and she was careful. She kept to herself. She took an extra moment to close the nursery door. She dried her hands thoroughly when she walked back into public rooms. She did not look at Fabio in ways that might betray the tawdry intimacy of gratitude. She was a cleaner. She would remain a cleaner. But the world of the house does not move in solitude. The vanishing of the cry did not mean the vanishing of attention. Whereas the staff had previously been frustrated and defensive, a different thing began to grow: curiosity that tasted like suspicion. People who had spent a lifetime polishing reputations can detect a stain before it dries. Dolores was one of them. Dolores watched with the clinical eye of a woman who had built and guarded a dynasty. To her, the baby's sudden improvement was unsettling for the same reason that an unexpected guest at a banquet is unsettling. It meant there was an element she did not control. She paid attention to the smallest discrepancies. If a cloth was out of place, it hinted at a breach. A faint, serene smile on her son's face when he spoke of the nursery was an anomaly she would not overlook. She said nothing at first. Her strategy was to gather facts and then decide the language of response. Her fingers drummed a quiet rhythm against the crystal in her hand. She suggested more surveillance out of the logic of preservation, not malice. "We must know the origin of sudden changes," she told Vera. And Vera, who understood the hierarchy of the house, moved to ensure that the nursery was monitored more strictly. Joanna felt in the weeks that followed a tide of attention like a pressure in the walls. She was careful, but Gael's body wanted what it wanted. Each time he latched, he relaxed into a sleep that depleted the lines under his eyes. He began to fill out, cheeks slowly rounding, strength gathering behind those two urgent cries. Dolores did not jump to accusations. She summoned people in ways she had long mastered. An offhand request for reports, a dinner with soft interrogation. Who saw what, she would ask, ostensibly about who had adjusted the nursery curtains. Her questions were surgical. They were designed to map a net rather than to strike. She understood that slander could be manufactured and weaponized, and she did not want to appear petty. Preemptive containment, she decided, was the only sensible form of defense. Inside Joanna, a different struggle unfolded. Each time she fed Gael, she felt the warm, familiar ache of a woman who had been pregnant with hope and had been left with only memory. The act was not pleasure in the way the tabloids implied. It was a kinetic prayer. It asked nothing in return, but a quiet right to do the smallest good. She told herself she would withdraw when necessary. She would not allow a child's survival to be bargaining material. Yet each night she walked home with pockets of grief softened by the knowledge that for at least a few hours the baby's breath was even and full. That knowledge held the dangerous clarity of a person who knows their action matters. Fabio, for his part, had not disclosed the nature of what happened to anyone beyond medical staff. He vacillated between gratitude and a fear he kept folded in the bottom drawer where men like him keep feelings they cannot yet name. He sensed the social cost, the possible scandal, the way his mother might weaponize a narrative that suggested weakness. Yet he also felt an overwhelming need to shield Gael. That need nudged his pride into unfamiliar territory. Pride, after all, is malleable where a child's life is concerned. The staff's conversations thickened into watchfulness. Vera increased the roster of people who passed by the nursery. The nanny on duty would linger longer to monitor the baby's patterns and report anomalies. The photographer who managed the family's events took liberties in his town connections and then found himself constrained by the villa's web of influence. People disposed to gossip felt an electric spark. A new narrative had arrived in a house that specialized in curated stories. Late one evening, when the sky outside the villa had the kind of bruised purple that makes small things seem vast, Joanna left the staff quarters and caught a glimpse of movement in the gardener's hands. He stood by the hedges, nervously scrolling a phone with a thumb that did not meet his fingers in the competence of a hobbyist. For a second, the screen glowed up toward her, and she saw a blurred image of a small face and a gray blur that might have been a hand. The sight tightened something in her chest. Fear, yes, but also recognition that private acts had found a way into public pixels. Joanna did not confront the gardener. She walked back to her dormitory with a silence heavier than her mop bag.
The house had felt like a safe vessel for a secret that saved a life. But secrets are like small fires. They warm and then they spread. Fabio, that same night, practiced how to speak about it. He rehearsed sentences that would frame Joanna's action in terms of necessity and not scandal. He practiced defending a woman who had acted to protect his son, while also bracing for the way the world would inevitably politicize a private act. There was a part of him that wanted to insulate Joanna, to offer formal employment beyond the cleaning roster, an attempt not at romance but at justice, a way to cure the asymmetry her service had created. But each time he imagined it, the house's architecture of status loomed as a cautionary whisper. How would Dolores react to such an upending of the expected order? How would the tabloids interpret it? How long would a photograph remain a thing unseen? For Joanna, the daily rhythm of care and secrecy had a physical toll. Her arms, once accustomed to lifting detergent boxes and bending to reach baseboards, now remembered the weight of a child's head on her chest. Her nights were threaded with images of Gael's restful cheeks. She walked through the villa's rooms with an intimacy that frightened her and comforted her in equal measure. Sometimes she would pause by the nursery window and watch the baby sleep, thinking of the child she had lost under different skies. Grief and life had braided themselves into a single cord she could not loosen. In the staff room, whispers moved like a slowly building current. Some praised covertly. The cook had a soft, judgmental affection for Joanna's bravery. Others, frightened by the potential scandal, found their tongues quick to caution. The house was a community built of small mercies and greater fears, and it reflected the outside world in miniature, people who loved security and people who resented differences in advantage. Dolores made a decision that night. She would not act out of instinct. She would collect proof. She would not be rude. Rudeness carries no authority, but she would not allow falsity to take root. She summoned the person on her private line who had always been useful when a rumor needed to be traced. A small, cold operator who knew how to prick a lie until it spilled. The woman's name was not uttered in the halls. She functioned in the margins, where images were purchased and narratives were controlled. Dolores's voice over the phone was calm as a guillotine. The next morning, while Joanna performed the same tasks she had always done, arranging towels, folding linens, Fabio asked her to sit in the nursery for a moment under the pretense of helping him choose curtains. He watched her, cataloging the small stoops of her shoulders, the way her hands moved with careful currency, He handed her a cup of coffee that she initially refused, and then took it when she accepted it. "You've done something no one could do," he said, uncertain of the tone.
I don't know how to thank you." Joanna accepted his thanks with a modest, practical nod. She kept the secret of the feeding as if it were a small, sacred object. She did not ask for gestures beyond an occasional wave in the kitchen. She wanted discretion, not reward. Even so, gratitude had a warmth that was hard to hide. Fabio's eyes, soft, rarely given to sentiment, bore into hers with an appreciation that unsettled and steadied her. Outside the nursery, the villa hummed with ordinary extravagance. An arrangement of orchids by the staircase that had been flown in from a greenhouse owned by the family. The soft clink of afternoon glasses in the parlor. Inside, a quiet revolution had taken place. Gael slept like a child who had been refound. Joanna washed the basin in her small kitchen and felt, for a moment, lightness that was almost criminal in its sweetness. But the photograph on the gardener's phone and the calls Dolores made that night were not idle. The house's social machinery had begun to turn. Somewhere between the break room's gossip and the strategist's quiet notes, an argument began to form. What is family, and who has the right to define it? If a maid could save a child, what threat did she pose to a lineage wrapped in porcelain? When the first call came to Dolores from an anonymous tip, suggesting that a staff member had been too familiar with the air, she folded it into a pile she was building. Her rationale was not simple malice. It was fear. She feared not for herself, but for the fragile perception that upheld everything she had spent her life constructing. And in certain sociologies, perception is a kind of currency, more brittle than coins, but equally capable of destroying a life. Weeks went by, and Gael's cheeks grew rounder with each passing appointment. Dr. Fernando, pragmatic and soft-eyed, noted progress and cautioned against abrupt changes. "Babies form more than a nutritional bond with breastfeeding," he told Fabio gently one afternoon in his office, ringed with CDs about infant behavior. "Breaking that bond suddenly can cause regression, sleep issues, feeding refusal, even hospitalization in extreme cases." Fabio nodded. He had been learning, awkwardly, to listen rather than command. The pages of Dr. Fernando's files became something more than data. They were evidence of a child's slow reclamation. The idea of taking away what was working because of a fear of perception felt increasingly spiteful. He found himself leaning toward a logic that placed his son above protocol, above reputation. But to tilt that way would be to set himself publicly against Dolores, and that had consequences. Joanna continued to live with a double life, one as a sober cleaner, another as the quiet source of nourishment for a child who needed more than formula. She felt the weight of the secret each night like a stone in her pocket. She had sheltered it with the same care she used to fold linens.
She had never wanted anything from Fabio beyond the knowledge that Gael would continue to be well. Yet in the architecture of the villa, symmetries shift. Acts of care create social friction in a house built on hierarchy. Small decisions gather like thunder in the distance. And then the first outward sign arrived. A note slipped into Vera's ledger from an unknown hand, indicating that an image had been shared beyond the staff's circle. The handwriting was deliberate. It read, in careful ink, that the family should be aware of something that might scandalize them. Vera, who had shepherded the villa's affairs for longer than most remembered, stood very still by the window and felt the first spasm of a storm she had been dreading. Joanna, oblivious to the initial currents of the coming tide, hummed as she arranged pillows in one of the guest rooms. Her hands were steady. Her face, when she thought no one watched, carried the faint resignation of someone who had given what she could and had not asked the world to be kind in return. Fabio, when he was told of the anonymous note, felt a new thing inside him, an anger that did not only belong to him. It was a protective rage, the kind that comes when a person imagines someone hurting the person who has done a quiet good. He thought of how to shield Joanna, to formalize her role perhaps, or at least to ensure that any photographs were destroyed and that discretion was maintained. The idea of removing her from the sphere that had suddenly become dangerous did not occur to him. He imagined instead a different posture, to place her under his protection, like one might place a hand under a fragile ornament. But protection requires more than a private flourish. It requires choices that are visible and therefore subject to public record. To make Joanna part of the household in a way that elevates her would be to invite speculation. For Dolores, that would feel like a surrender. For Fabio, it felt like a small revolution worth the trouble. That night, after the household had retired and the villa settled into a hush polished by security systems, Joanna lay awake in her sparse room. Outside, the rain had returned, a steady curtain that made the world feel smaller. She thought of Gael, his small fingers, of how they had gripped hers in that first moment. She had not told a soul about the way his mouth had found her, and yet she had not been able to forget. Grief and tenderness had braided inside her like roots binding the earth. She had lost once. The memory of that loss had become a cautionary ghost. Yet here, in this house of sconces and marble, she had been given a chance to do something that felt like righting a wrong she could not name. In the kitchen downstairs, a staff member slotted a new photograph into a private album. It was not a clear picture, its edges were blurred, but it showed a small limp thing and a woman with a cloth.
The eyes that looked at it saw different things. The eyes that looked at it saw different things. The village cook saw a woman saving a child. Dolores saw an image that threatened a meticulously arranged life. Others saw gossip that was simply delicious. Whoever had taken that photo had not meant for it to be blown into an open window yet. They had left it like a seed. And seeds, moved by the wrong hands, grow fast. The next morning, Fabio found himself lingering at the nursery door, listening to a child's contented snuffle, grappling with a choice that would ripple outward. He knew, with a clarity that had nothing to do with his wealth, that this was not only about image. It was about a small life that had been brought back from a thin place by a woman who, by every social script, was meant to remain an invisible servant. That the act would arouse social heat was inevitable. Nonetheless, he felt the urge to stand before that heat and say flatly that Gael's survival mattered more than the fear of gossip. Joanna, after the shift, walked past the courtyard pool where the sun made the water look like liquid glass. She held her cleaning supplies like armor and felt the world tilt under the weight of a secret she had kept because it was the right thing to do. She had never asked for more than the ability to do what was necessary to keep a child alive. Yet now she found herself in the strange position of being the woman around whom scandal might revolve. Nobody in the house could say exactly when the gravity of that single morning would pull the rest of their lives along its arc. They could only live the days in the tiny, consequential motions. A bottle warmed, a lullaby hummed, a photograph transmitted. The villa, with all its resources, could not insulate its people from the small human gestures that change everything. In a world calibrated by prestige and caution, the spontaneous act of feeding a hungry child had introduced an undecidable element into the equation. And in those days, before Dolores's plans hardened, and before a woman from the world of covert reputations arrived to stir the pot, the villa seemed fragile in a new way, alive with the possibility that a single gentle choice might upend everything it had been designed to protect. On a morning of softened sun, as Joanna watched Gael doze with the small inhale of a child whose hunger had been stilled, a phone buzzed in Dolores's study. A message arrived with minimal words. Someone has a photo. Dolores read it, closed her eyes briefly, and then picked up the line to call a contact whose business was silencing inconvenient images before they became stories. Her voice, when she spoke, was the sound of someone writing an invoice. Calm, economical, decisive. "Find out," she said. "Secure whatever you must. Discretion. I don't want the house embarrassed."
At the same moment, Fabio sat at the edge of the bed in his private suite and watched footage from the nursery's internal camera, replaying the slow, steady night of the previous week. On a humid afternoon, she slipped into the break room and, with the soft competence of someone who had once forced confessions, nudged a phone across a table. The gardener, flattered and frightened, let his thumb scroll through the screen. There, in the slanted light, the blurred photo sat like a wound. He did not know, and Carla did not tell him, that in less than 24 hours a copy of that image would be in the hands of a gossip columnist whose business depended on scandal. When the story broke, it did not land like a bomb so much as a weather front. It arrived with wind and rumor, with the whispering approach of something that would not stop until it had soaked everything it touched. The headline was politely phrased but hungry. Private moments, public house, questions surround heir's care. Social media carried the pixelated photo as if it were a trophy. The villa's number, normally reserved for chauffeurs and florists, began to ring with strangers who smelled a story. For Joanna, the first awareness of exposure came in small domestic ways. The house phone rang with an unfamiliar tone. A neighbor in the staff quarters looked at her with pinched curiosity. The morning briefing that morning featured Vera with a face that read like a closed door. She felt the air tighten around her chest in a way that had nothing to do with the work she knew how to do. Her instinct was not to hide the truth, but to minimize its consequences. She had always believed that the best way to keep the world humane was to make herself as little a burden as possible. Now, the world had different ideas. Fabio saw the first wave of the storm differently, as an attack on the one corner of his life where he had felt utterly powerless, now complicated by gratitude and a debt he could not easily name. He moved through his days trying to write the right sentence in his head, how to explain that a woman had done, in a private corner of his life, the right thing for a child. He rehearsed both the language of a defense and the language of a man who wanted to shield someone whose only offense had been compassion. Dolores responded with the surgical calm of someone who had always preferred to rearrange potential scandal into harmless fragments. She did not shout, she did not call the press herself. Instead, she rang an old contact, a man who knew how to make images disappear and how to make narratives bend. He advised a restrained but public plan: silence, sign a confidentiality clause with the staff, and displace the conversation with a charitable notice about the infant's health. Dr. Sampaio, consulted in the privacy of her salon, spoke of legal options and reputational triage. "We must protect the institution," he advised. "Appear decisive, but be economical with anger." Economical anger, however, did not satisfy everyone. The tabloids smelled blood, and a market for outrage opened. A local blogger framed the story as moral confusion. What does it mean when servants cross the boundary? And the question became a prism through which strangers argued, as if the child's body were a map of some larger social war. The villa, usually a place where problems were resolved with contracts and appointments, felt suddenly porous. Joanna, who had expected that secrecy might become trouble if found, did not expect the degree of nakedness that followed. Men and women who had known her as the person who ironed ties and mended gloves began to measure her with a different kind of look, some with sympathy, others with the hunger of those who find drama delicious. The first formal confrontation came quietly, under the guise of procedure. Vera asked Joanna to sit in the manager's office where the afternoon light slanted across diplomas and a photograph of a philanthropist shaking hands with the family patriarch. Fabio accompanied them but remained in the doorway. He did not yet have the courage to sit in the center of an argument he felt himself losing before he had spoken. "Joanna," Vera began, her tone careful and official, "we have received complaints and some images. You understand the seriousness." She folded her hands like someone tucking a map into a drawer. The gravity in her voice was not cruelty. It was a ledger, the way a house keeps accounts. Joanna's answer was honest in the way of someone whose motives were simple and, she hoped, unavoidable.
"I fed the baby because he was dying," she said, each word measured but not rehearsed. "He would not take a bottle. He needed the milk. I did it because I had it. I did it because no one else could stop his crying. I was afraid to tell because I knew how people would see it." The room took in her statement like a breath. Fabio stepped forward then, not to argue, but to buttress. "She helped our son," he said. "I am thankful. It's not a scandal. It's a life saved." Dolores, who had been summoned under the pretense of a family meeting, arrived without ceremony. The air changed when she entered. All of the small sounds in the room seemed to rearrange themselves to make space for her authority. She did not rise in the melodramatic fashion of villains in plays. She simply lowered her eyes and spoke with precise coldness. "You made a choice you had no right to make," she said to Joanna. "You violated lines. In my house, there are things we do not blur." There, in that brief exchange, the conflict's bones were revealed. An action that had saved a life, colliding with a social script that valued boundaries and image. The language of gratitude met the language of order, and between them, the child's need was at risk of being reduced to a question of precedent. Dolores's response to the photograph had less to do with Joanna's humanity than with the fear of a narrative that might suggest weakness in her family, an image that could be wielded by rivals, by the press, by those who would say the Brazans cared more for appearances than people. She feared the suggestion that an outsider could be closer to the sink of the family's emotional life than a member of the clan. It was not that she did not care for Gael. She cared in a manner futurist and institutional, and so she set in motion a restraint. Joanna was to be kept from the nursery pending an internal inquiry. That directive, administrative in tone, was devastating in effect. For Joanna it was an exile of the kind that kills quietly. Absence from the small human duty that had finally given her life a small soft center. She returned to her room with her hands trembling not from shame, but from a grief that sounded like a small child's cry in the hollow of her ribs. Fabio tried to argue otherwise. He made the case for continued access, the medical records, Dr. Fernando's notes, the baby's weight gain. He spoke of risks, psychological regression, the loss of established feeding patterns, the irreplaceable immune benefits of human milk. Dr. Fernando's voice, measured and concerned, could be quoted. "If the infant is abruptly weaned, we risk dehydration, refusal to accept alternative feeding methods, a breakdown in sleep, and a regression in weight gain," he said in the meeting, his stethoscope like a punctuation on his sentences. "If what works is human milk, we either continue safely or ensure there is an acceptable and medically supervised substitute." Dolores's counsel, with the legalese Dr. Sampaio supplied, argued a different calculus: social harm, precedent, and risk to the family's long-term interests. He spoke of contracts, of the optics of publicity, of the dangers of allowing staff to occupy roles beyond what was contracted. "You need to think about the family as an institution," he told Dolores in her office. "Institutions require clarity." This logic set the scene for a painful inversion. The man with wealth and the woman with the means argued for shielding the brand. The woman with empty hands argued for the life under her care. The villa's rules, once practical and mundane, became levers in a struggle about who had the authority to decide what a child needed. When the official order arrived, it was delivered with a bland bureaucracy that tried to sanitize cruelty. Joanna would not be allowed in the nursery until the investigation concluded. She was reassigned to daytime laundry and deep cleaning of the south wing, tasks meant to be both useful and punitive in their invisibility. The reaction among the staff split into adherents of sympathy and adherents of caution. The cook quietly left out an extra plate of food for Joanna and pretended to happen upon it later. The gardener offered strained smiles. The nanny, who had supervised the first feeding, avoided Joanna's eyes as if their last shared moment had planted a question in her she did not want to answer. The first day without Joanna at Gael's side was small and brutal and bureaucratic. The child's appetite faltered. He ate a little formula, but he refused the bottles he had once accepted even in moments of need.
He woke more at night, his sleep scattered and shallow. Fabio watched, as a man watches a weather system he cannot control. The baby's cheeks, once rounding with steady improvement, lost a touch of their fullness. Dr. Fernando's concern shifted from general monitoring to urgent recommendation, a return to a feeding pattern that reassured the child's nervous system. Dolores was unbending at first. Her position was not cruel so much as fixed. She believed that to preserve the family's future, she must make choices now the family would uphold for generations. She feared a slippery slope. If staff could feed children, what else might they do? Her pride framed her worry in the language of stewardship and hereditary responsibility. Then came the call that made math and reputation fall away. Gael developed a fever that did not respond to routine measures, and he began to show signs of the kind of dehydration that terrified everyone in a child's small body. He was taken to the hospital. The emergency room is a place where the trappings of class blur into something elemental. Fabio, used to decisions being made in glass towers with committees and briefings, found himself in a fluorescent-lit room where the choices were immediate and personal. Machines charted a child's breath. Nurses moved with the even tempo of people who do not allow sentiment to cloud triage. Joanna, excluded, waited outside the ward like someone at an altar who had not been invited. In that sterile hinterland, Dr. Fernando explained in the blunt, urgent language medicine reserves for moments when theory meets fragile bodies. When an infant is suddenly cut off from a source they have relied on, the autonomic regulation that milk and skin-to-skin contact provide is disrupted, he said. We can attempt supplementation with donor milk, we can try expressed milk, we can sedate and tube feed if necessary, but none of those options replicate the immediate physiological comfort he received. The abruptness is damaging in a way that isn't just sentiment, it's biologically relevant. Fabio felt something in him break and realign. It was not only the son he feared losing, it was also the knowledge that his own pride had been an obstacle to a woman who had acted out of the oldest of impulses. He did not understand how to behave in a world where compassion required him to disobey the institution that had raised him, but he understood that the child on the monitor did not care for dynastic theory. He moved through the villa like a man with a private mission. He called Dolores and asked quietly for a reconsideration. He called Dr.
Sampaio and said, simply, "We need medical guidance, not optics." He asked that the house be practical. Cleanliness and contract could wait. "I will take responsibility," he told both of them in different tones. To his mother, he spoke with a reasoning that edged toward pleading. To his lawyer, he spoke with the authority he had learned from a life of negotiation. Neither approach fully worked at first. Meanwhile, the press smelled the hospital visit, and, in a world primed for spectacle, transformed it into a headline. Fabio's phone lit with calls from anchors and gossip pages. Dolores seethed. She perceived strategy in every ring. "If this becomes public, we will have to control the narrative," she told her lawyer. "We must avoid an image of the heir in danger because of poor management." Control, though, had become a chimera. The fortress of talismanic reputation could not contain the biological. The life beating under a baby blanket did not care for spin. At the hospital, Joanna sat in a corridor that smelled like disinfectant and coffee and felt the world close to her like a thin lid. She had no voice in the decisions being made for the child she had fed. The impotence bit. She watched a hospital staff member wheel a monitor down the hall and thought of the little hand that had once curled around her sleeve. The world had laws and norms and money and fear, but a child's need is not a subject for committees. In a small human moment that will never make a paper or a press hit list, a nurse offered Joanna a chair in a corner near Gail's room. The nurse did not ask for permission or offer judgments. She simply recognized what humans who work with infants often do, that a mother figure, any mother figure, near a child can matter. There is a difference between policy and bedside. It is a difference that often saves quiet lives.
Fabio watched the charts and felt an anger not at his mother's intention, but at how the machinery of reputation had been allowed to outrun the simplest human imperative. He had designed facilities and buildings to endure storms. He had not designed for the quiet moral storms that arise when one has to decide which of two loyalties to honor. Standing in the hospital hallway, the neatness of his suits meant nothing. What mattered was whether he would finally choose to protect the person who had acted to save his son. He went to Dolores, who had come to the hospital with an armor of concern that read like a ledger of consequences. "It's my son," he said simply. The sentence did not ask for permission. Joanna saved him. We cannot pretend her action was another kind of thing. His eyes held a steady, new gravity. We will do what medicine says, even if it's inconvenient for the house. Dolores's face shifted, pride creasing into something that looked like private calculation. For a woman whose life had been built on the slow accumulation of authority, the moment required a surrender. It was not immediate nor easy.
"If we do this," she said, voice colder than before, "we must be careful. The world will not forgive care without paperwork. We will lose standing if we are seen as being careless." The choice needed no counsel. Fabio acted. He removed Joanna's restriction. He issued orders, not to save face, but to save life. He authorized medically supervised feedings, with Dr. Fernando overseeing every step. It was a small revolution, the billionaire using his power not to build things, but to restore a right that a child needed. For Joanna, the return to the nursery felt like a small resurrection. She walked there with hands that trembled, not from fear of scandal, but from the weight of being needed. Yet the story, once in public, refused to be contained. The columnist printed speculation about motives. A radio show wondered whether Joanna's action suggested a scandal of morals and class. The tabloids produced opinion pieces and pundits. The villa's public relations team drafted statements that focused on the child's health and the family's gratitude to the medical staff, careful to avoid naming the woman who had saved him. Joanna was not seeking applause. She wanted a continuation of what had been necessary. But once the world decided to narrate the event, the shapes around it hardened. Carla, who had orchestrated the narrative's leak, realized she had created an asset. She tried to sell the full set of images and a so-called inside account to a media outlet. Her demands were mercenary. She had no claim to heroism, only to a market she understood well. When the price was too high, she offered the materials to a tabloid. Dolores, alerted by her own channels, intercepted the deal by aggressively offering a retainer to anyone who would keep the house's privacy intact. Money exchanged hands, an old and ugly truth, but it did not erase the public's hunger for narrative. Eventually, the paper published a version of events that painted Joanna with a variety of tones: savior, interloper, and the dangerous other. None of the articles fully matched the truth in Joanna's heart. Fabio watched the public parade of opinions and felt a quiet fury. The same man who closed deals with calm decisions now found himself unable to stomach the idea that gratitude could be transformed into an accusation. He hired a lawyer to protect Joanna's rights, not out of fear of legal liability for the house, but because he believed the woman should not be publicly pilloried for saving his child. It was a choice that defied his mother's counsel, and for the first time it positioned him against her in a way that made their arguments not abstract questions of reputation, but sharp, personal fractures. In front of the cameras, because cameras always arrived whether invited or not, he made an unplanned statement. It was not scripted by PR teams, nor polished by legal advice. He stood in the villa's garden where reporters clustered like birds, microphones thrust forward, phones held high. The sounds around him hissed with hunger for disruption. "He is my son," Fabio said, his voice simple, not theatrical. "A woman who worked for my family acted to keep him alive. I will not allow gratitude to be criminalized. I will not allow the thing that restored my son to be turned into a weapon." His eyes searched the crowd and found the one whose life he was holding in his hands. He found Joanna among the staff, folding a towel with her head bowed, as if she were invisible. He walked to her then, and, without ceremony, reached out and took her hand in front of the cameras, an act that was small and enormous at once. He would later insist the gesture was private, but in the instant it became the image the press longed to make a scandal. Dolores, watching the scene from the house's drawing room, felt the world tilt. Her reproach to her son was private and venomous. "This is a mistake," she said. "This will not end well." But the tide had turned. The house that had once dictated the contours of identity had been breached by a human act that refused to be fashioned by image. People outside the house reacted in various ways. Some cheered at the human decency. Others clucked and spoke of loss of social order. But the most immediate effect was practical. Fabio's public defense made it more difficult for the tabloids to continue painting Joanna as a villain. The narrative shifted. A new image, a hand taken in gratitude, competed with the blurry photo. The world's appetite is fickle. It will follow the image that best fits its mood. Then came the legal ripples. Dr. Sampaio, who had advised Dolores to contain the story, now found himself in a different role, one of damage control. A defamation claim was considered by the family's legal strategists against the tabloids. Carla's attempt to sell still images was investigated, and a quiet settlement offered to certain staff members served as an implicit apology from the villa's PR machine. The law, in this story, functioned as both shield and sword, tools to be used by the powerful or to discourage the hungry. Joanna confronted a different, subtler court, the court of human judgment inside the villa and in her own heart. The public defense had been Fabio's, not hers. He had taken the risk that might alienate his family and his social circle. Joanna, who had never wanted the limelight, felt its hot breath on her skin. She had been accused, admired, denounced, and defended all at once. When the initial frenzy subsided into a new daily life of guarded normalcy, she sat with Dr. Fernando one afternoon and said the thing she had avoided. "I did not tell him," she said, voice low. "I was ashamed. I thought they would not understand. I thought I would be taken away from it. I thought I would be blamed." The confession came with neither theatrical penance nor expectation. It was simply an offering. Dr. Fernando listened without judgment. He had worked with infants and human bodies long enough to know the shape of moral complications. "You acted to protect a life," he said. "That is a defensible action in the language of medicine and of conscience. But secrecy has consequences. We will try to make sure the child recovers fully. After that, decisions about trust and employment will need to be made transparently." Trust had indeed been tested. The villa's management, wanting to reassert protocols, offered Joanna a new role, one with a contract and official responsibilities that included care under supervision. It was an attempt to reconcile the human reality with institutional needs. Joanna accepted cautiously. She wanted the child's well-being above all. Acceptance meant she might be compelled to face those who would not forgive silence. Dolores did not forgive quickly, but she did not remain static. Time, and the sight of gaunt cheeks filling out again as Gael responded to careful, supervised feedings, softened some of her rigidity. The grandmother who had feared a break in the family's armor watched her grandson smile at a toy, and felt a tenderness that complicated her resolve. She did not apologize in a sweeping way, but in private moments she found herself lingering near the nursery, where the small life she once feared losing thrived. The public attention, however, had left its marks. Joanna's name trended for a few painful days. Strangers sent messages of praise and messages of condemnation. Some offered money. One woman sent a small hand-knit blanket and an envelope containing a note that simply said, "You did right." Joanna kept the blanket and the note, folding them into a drawer like proof that the world retained some pockets of kindness. The crisis laid bare another landscape, the precariousness of the staff's lives. Once a story is wart, gossip becomes currency and leverage. Some staff members who had been cautious in their sympathy felt pressure from families who sought to keep their own cleanliness of reputation. The small politics of survival played out in half-spoken sentences and furtive glances. The house's neat machinery reassembled itself around new rituals and new rules. It would have been tidy to end the conflict with legal victories and contrite apologies. The story in life, however, is less theatrical. The villa, its crystal, its marble, its pedigreed portraits, rearranged slowly. Fabio made choices that were neither purely heroic nor naive. He offered Joanna stable employment and made sure the hospital bills were covered without fuss. He continued to be present in the nursery in ways that had nothing to do with image. He learned to read diapers and to hum lullabies badly, but with devotion. That devotion, observed in all its awkwardness, changed how the house read him. Then the decisive public moment arrived, not as a court case, but as a family occasion that should have been a display of the villa's carefully curated success.
It was the anniversary gala, a night when the house opened its doors for philanthropic reasons and the press went hunting for photographs. Dolores had insisted on the gala in part to reassert a confident public face. A carefully selected guest list, crystal candelabras, and a program of speeches all were prepared to reinforce the image of a family steady as a capital letter. Fabio, who could have retreated into privacy, chose that night to do something that would upend the careful choreography. As the charity chair ascended to give the speech, Fabio took the microphone before the program's end and spoke off the cuff. He did not speak about deals nor charity projects. He spoke about a child and about simple duty. "You know me as someone who builds," he said, looking out at the crowd that had come to applaud philanthropic towers. "Tonight, I want to build something that matters more than walls." He spoke of gratitude, of the woman who had kept his son alive, and of the cowardice of letting fear of gossip dictate care. "In light of all that has happened," he concluded, "I ask you to witness my choice." There was a soft scandal in the room as he walked down the aisle and, without flourish, took Joanna's hand. He asked her to stand beside him, not as a spectacle, but as an assertion. He announced, in a voice that echoed under crystal chandeliers, that he intended to marry her. The sentence trembled and then steadied in the hush. The reaction was immediate and varied. Cameras flashed like a geological survey. Whispers turned into audible gasps. Dolores's face registered a sorrow that was not wholly political. To many guests, the announcement seemed unthinkable. For others, it felt like the only sensible move. If gratitude and duty demanded a home for those who acted humanely, marriage made a public statement that no law, no gossip would erase. Joanna's answer, when she found a voice that was not wrapped in fear, was a quiet affirmation. Not a theatrical yes, but a steady acceptance of what she had come to know as right. She also demanded, in the privacy of the moment, that her relationship to the house be legalized in ways that ensured security for the staff who did the work that purchased these images of civility. Fabio agreed. The wedding that followed was not a society page event. It was both a rebellion and a vow. Some guests left in offended silence. Others stayed and watched a different kind of union be formed, one stitched by need and gratitude and the absurd, stubborn hope that people can change. Dolores did not attend the ceremony in the way the tabloids wanted. She arrived later and sat at the back, her hands clasped, eyes wet for reasons that were perhaps both pride and a grief for how little control she had kept. Her daughter-in-law was someone she had once considered a ghost of the household, but now sat at the head table with a new name and new duties.
Later, in an exchange that no headline could compress, Dolores and Joanna had a terse conversation where old fears were named and then, haltingly, softened by the sight of a grandchild smiling at both of them. It was an imperfect reconciliation.
Dolores did not become instantly maternal in the way Joanna might have wanted, but she began to make room, to be less rigid in the rhythms that had structured her life. The years that followed grew around smaller things. Gael, who had once seemed poised on the edge of thinness, became a boy who climbed the villa's lesser trees with a stubborn laugh. He called Joanna Tia at first, an auntie who had been there, until the language of the house expanded and he began to say mommy in the private time when the house was quiet. The public narrative softened into the family's private life. People who had once scrolled past scandal now walked past a child's drawing of a stick family taped to the refrigerator, in which 3 figures stood together under a scribbled sun. Carla, who had tried to sell scandal before it had time to harden into a single story, found her market cooled by Fabio's intervention and the shifting public sentiment. She moved on to other stories, because the trade of rumor is a business that keeps its practitioners busy. The tabloids printed retrospectives that debated the meanings of class and the ethics of intervention. But headlines, like weather, quickly moved on. The villa, which had been a museum of curated images, learned to include a new kind of portrait, one that acknowledged human messiness. The staff were given contracts that protected overtime and provided health care. The house's policies changed to include clearer procedures for staff-initiated medical interventions, supervised and documented. None of this fixed the legacy of suspicion, but it created buffers that meant fewer people would be left to act alone next time. Fabio and Joanna's marriage was not a fairy tale of untroubled joy. There were frictions. Class differences do not dissolve overnight, and the habits of a life of private power and a life of practicing scarcity have to negotiate with startling bluntness sometimes. Joanna learned how to navigate a world she had once only entered to clean. Fabio learned how to be present in ways that did not feel performative. They argued and made up, bought a modest house outside the villa for their small nights away, and found in domestic unpredictability the kind of intimacy that is not public spectacle but stubborn repair. Dolores, in time, softened further than anyone outside the family would have predicted. Not because she had converted entirely to a different worldview, but because the simple sight of her grandson's laugh eroded some of the sharpness that had been fortified by a lifetime of caution. She began to bring him small gifts. Books with regal bindings that made Gael laugh because the colors inside were comic and messy. And sometimes, in private, she apologized in the way older ancestors do. Not with grand words, but with small gestures that acknowledged error. In the end, what sustained the household was not a tabloid's approval, but the steady, repetitive acts that build and keep a family. A child tucked in at night, a soup made when someone is sick, the quiet paying of a hospital bill without publicity. Joanna found in the family a place that gave her stability and a dignity she had not imagined possible. She became an advocate for staff rights inside the villa, quietly pushing for better conditions, for days off, for recognition. She never became the temptation of scandal the way some headlines had painted her. She became, in the most ordinary sense, indispensable. The epilogue of their lives was not a polished moral, but a scene that was, in its smallness, a proof. Years later, in the garden that had once been full of reporters, a new child toddled on soft grass. The family gathered, Dolores slower now, but present, Fabio with a laugh that had grown deeper from worry and repair, Joanna kneeling beside a little person who reached for her hand with a trust that had nothing to do with headlines. Who is family? The house had asked itself in whispers in its first days of scandal. The answer, over time, had become less about blood and more about who fed who stayed up through the night, who bore grief, and who tightened their hands when the world tried to turn kindness into currency. In that garden, with 2 children tumbling and an older woman watching with softened eyes, the question dissolved into an ordinary demonstration. Family is the collection of those who love in practice. The villa kept its chandeliers and its reputations, but it also learned an ugly truth about being human, that the things we are afraid to name, grief, hunger, shame, need practical answers more than reputational hygiene. Joanna's action had been a small, human solution to a biological problem. It produced waves because society needed to confront a question that had little to do with a photograph and everything to do with compassion. If the story leaves a single trace, it is this: when a life is at stake, acts of care, quiet, inconvenient, unglamorous, are not only necessary but transformative. The household's arc did not become a sermon nor a tabloid cautionary tale. It became a messy, human narrative about how people bend and how love that feeds cannot be contained by etiquette. Years later, when Fabio and Joanna sat on a porch watching children chase the late sun across the lawn, he would sometimes reach for her hand and say nothing.
The silence, now comfortable, contained what the villa's earlier mistrust could not: a knowledge that some choices, however scandalous they might have seemed at first, are simply the right ones for keeping a small life breathing. If this story moved you, like and share it, and tell us in the comments what you would have done in Joanna's place.